Okay. Recording in progress. Okay. um.
Yeah,
Okay.
being a nomad myself, I was curious to hear more about lavender from Ken. So if you
Yeah.
could get your mic working, that would be great. But I've had similar ideas of like, and I don't know how close this idea is to what you're working on, but um, of just having kind of like sustained data disclosure between people I meet on the road and being able to kind of like, oh, hey, I'm traveling into this town and you're also traveling kind of nearby. Let's adjust our travel paths and sync up, that kind of thing. Like um, without having to like share my location permanently or something like that. You know what I mean? So I don't know. There's a lot of cool things that can be done with that for sure.
Yeah, that actually ties into some of the wireless stuff that I think Brent and I have been working on either tandemly, either in tandem or circumstantially, because wireless has one of the few properties where it's local first, which means that the you only get signal based on the range of your influence. So if you've got a like a local transmitter that only has like a 5 kilometer range, the only people who can hear you or your messages are in a 5 kilometer range of that transmission. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of interesting crossover between like data algorithms, like physical infrastructure, and then like maybe more mechanistic processes.
Okay, my mic should be working now. Yeah, so as far as the idea of setting up a spatial locality where you have an awareness of other people, whether at some level of resolution, whether or not they're in a region, a city, and so on. Yeah, I agree. That's like really foundational to everything that I would want to achieve. And so so basically the reason why I set this up is because my wife is a digital nomad, and then she kept on traveling, and she kept on traveling independently from me. And so I realized, oh, well, now I have to kind of set up my lifestyle in a way where my interests can coordinate with her interests. And so this is where I started getting interested into the lifestyle of digital nomads. And this first thing that came up as a constant need was, okay, I meet all these great people on the road or in these co-livings, and then I don't sync up with them again. And really, the only way I can attempt to sync up is if I'm actively monitoring them on their Instagram or so on, or they remember me when they're in a different location, and we have this coincidental, oh, hey, you're here. Okay, well, let's meet up. So that idea of like an ambient locational awareness is the first feature that I was considering because it seems to be something that you could work with independent. Like it's a nice small task, meaning that if you're trying to prototype any local first functionality, it's a nice toy task to benchmark latency requirements. But beyond that, yeah, like from there, like there's a lot of stuff that becomes possible, and then from there, I've mainly tailoring to digital moments specifically, rather than other cases. Because in the RFC, like there were some people who said, "Oh, I could totally use this," but their cases weren't perfectly aligned with what I was doing, even though the tech might align with it.
If you're still looking to interview people, I'd love to chat more because, yeah, like I said, I'm living the digital nomad life and struggling to kind of like meet and sync up with people, even though I know there's like tons of people out there. So yeah, I'd love to chat more about it if you're still interviewing people.
Yeah, for sure.
Brand, should we talk about the actual videos now?
Yeah, it seems like we get sidetracked from that, but it was a thing that we committed to a couple weeks ago. Um, to go through this playlist of semantic web technologies because we were studying the value flows ontology and we had Lynn Foster on there and she was kind of helping us guide it through there. But I don't know. She doesn't say semantic web is like absolutely necessary and like Color REA doesn't even use RDF, but it uses the ontology underneath. But I guess from my approach, I don't know from other people's approaches, I wanted to study OVN and understand exactly what it meant and what the different logical relationships were. So it kind of segued into, well, what's RDF, what is OWL, and so we got, and Gabriel asked, well, what's a good playlist? What can we study? So I brought up Harold Sachs' course, which I had at least seen part of it a couple years ago, and so now we're kind of in this section where he's getting into what an ontology is and what logic is, and there's a lot of things in there. As I was going through there, it was like a lot of information, but it occurred to me that, well, one, I was kind of binge watching it because I was a little late this week, but it occurred to me that, like, oh, this is a case where if I want to get good at this, I need to do a lot of exercises. I mean, it was just like, this was like kind of the cheat sheet in the back of the book of what different types of logic and how you do proofs and stuff. In a nutshell, but does anybody else have like some? How do you break it down? It seemed like out of video 4.6, it kind of got really deep.
I love this portion of the videos because I have like really like most recently been really interested in how to kind of like what an ontology is, what a taxonomy is, how we can so the limits of my world, or the limit of my language is the limit of my world. I don't know, somebody said that quote, and it's kind of been ringing in my ears for a few years now, and I'm like, well, how do we kind of get people to kind of group up around language, like shared concepts, and like across space and time, like helping people kind of like group up and find knowledge representations together. And so I feel like these videos were like getting it all into kind of the formal methods of like, and the philosophy of like these things of like, what is knowledge, what is what does it mean to kind of structure knowledge or to structure language, and to use those things as tools. And yeah, I feel like I have to rewatch them like 100 times because I definitely like did not pick it all up. Like, but it's, yeah, I'm gonna make it a point to like go back and rewatch these videos because I can tell it's gonna be like really important for what I want to do in terms of basically helping people create, I guess, their own custom vocabulary for their own way of thinking, but then also linking up with other people's vocabularies of concepts and everything, or ontology, whatever you want to say, and being able to, without even knowing the person, like learn from each other and find people who think like you and that kind of stuff. Like that's what I want to build towards, and this is definitely seeming like a fertile ground to basically, I don't know, codify these things and build really good UX to kind of like help people group up around shared thinking. So really cool videos.
I have a little bit of I'll say that I have a background, but it's mainly a background from osmosis, from working adjacently with scientists in the agricultural and biomedical fields, creating tools that are supporting a lot of their workflows, which relied on ontologies. From my experience, there's like the technology is great, but over time, it's interesting to see where the promises have panned out and where they've not panned out, and where they're kind of revamping or being revisited again. The semantic web has been, but for a lot of people, it feels like a cursed discipline because the languages themselves can be quite subtle. The conceptual knowledge required is quite subtle. But I think the key thing is the underrating of something that is not like a hard constraint on adapting semantic web technologies, but just something that a lot of engineers seem to pass up on, is that when you're developing an ontology or a controlled vocabulary or representation, that system is always going to be an open system. because as knowledge is revised, so are our categories, and oftentimes we also have to abandon categories or come up with ad hoc categorizations when dealing with interdisciplinary constructs. So this ends up being the need for a knowledge management community on top of whatever system is being constructed as the representational system for creating inference across knowledge. And over time, interestingly enough, there's been a tendency to weaken the logical representations of knowledge rather than strengthen the logical representations of knowledge, simply because when you have like a very rich set of associations, things like negation go out the window. Like you can't really represent it properly. You can try to do some formal concept analysis that under restricted domains gives you the framework to define operations like negation, implication in some logically consistent way, but they end up being restricted cases of the whole. And interestingly enough, I think this is like where LLMs become good, because they might be a way to find those restricted domains in representation itself. The paper I linked to, What's Wrong with Knowledge Management, is by a very interesting computer scientist, Mark Burgess, who deals with the issue of representation of knowledge. And he tries to like say, well, people that use ontologies, they forget that ontologies are a growing thing, and they really reflect systems of social norms, and as such, like the languages like RDF are not tailored to grow knowledge in a particular way. I think that this would be worth visiting as like a comparative for studying the semantic web and also studying criticisms of the semantic web without throwing the entire thing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'll have to give it a read. Well, like one thing to add to what you said. So you said RDF is like, I forget exactly what you said, but something along the lines of RDF not being adequate to basically create representations of knowledge. I think that's kind of why, because there were some videos in the playlist where he talks about the limits of the limitations of RDF and how you can't, convey certain things in it, right? And so then you have like these higher level things over that, like ontology modeling and all that kind of stuff to kind of compensate and have a necessary degree of expressiveness and resolving some of these limitations by introducing higher level structures. Because yeah, like I totally agree, like ontologies they need to be flexible. Like people try to kind of like create this like Orwellian like one ontology to rule them all. Like, oh, what if we just kind of created one vocabulary or something? But that's like such a fool's errand, and it's a short-sighted view of like what we're dealing with here, right? And so I think like embracing just the absolute maximum chaos of infinite vocabularies and trying to kind of like highlight the connection points and the analogies and bridges between vocabularies and ontologies and everything, that I feel like that's the direction that needs to be leaned into. And then also like the technical difficulty and subtlety and preciseness that's necessary to implement these things needs to be, made much, much, much easier and not dependent on developers doing it manually. That's just not going to happen. Like it just needs to kind of be a passive, automatic thing that happens when people use software. And yeah, I don't know. There's just so many reasons why the semantic web didn't take off and still isn't taking off.
It hasn't taken off in a way where consumers are directly in the loop for the creation of new vocabularies or ontologies. It's sort of taken off in contexts where you have the need to either you're a very big corporation and you're trying to reconcile or harmonize data types inside the corporation so that between teams there can be a common query layer that can allow you to get like several different perspectives on a particular problem at once. Or you have like a distributed data consortium, which is similar. It's just that you don't have like a central governance. You have more like a federal or committee-based oriented kind of governance for the quality of data and the harmonization of data. But in terms of like a common thing that everyone in the web subscribes to independently as a part of being a good digital citizen, no, the semantic web did not take off in that way. Even though that the technology, because it was pushed by, I guess, I forget the name of the authority that does these things, but the World Wide Web Consortium, like W3C, of course they're very interested in getting the whole web to be on board with this, but for individual websites or even for corporations, like to deal with the conversations that you have to think about with content and assigning semantics to content, that's an administrative overhead, and so that ends up being something that's like essentially the thing you have to automate away. Like, how do we have good enough approximations that can be easily reversed or corrected when assigning semantics to content, and how do we make inference loose enough so that we don't have to care too much about fragile reasoning when we're assigning semantics to things and they end up being too restrictive. One interesting thing about the Burgess paper is that it articulates this ambiguity of hierarchy very concisely, I think. So if you have a graph or like a knowledge representation that is a graph, any hierarchy inside of that web of associations corresponds to a minimum spanning tree computed on that graph. And so what's interesting about the minimum spanning tree algorithm is that, well, it's ambiguous. You can actually have multiple trees exist on the same web that all reflect a minimal tree or hierarchy, just depending on the entry point that you decide is the top node. And so it just shows that in like graphs themselves are ambiguous as far as the hierarchies they define, and whatever central concept that someone takes as the top level concept that all their conceptions have to be based on, it really just depends on the context. It's an arbitrary choice. So to me, I agree that it's kind of like a fool's errand, because if you just start thinking about semantics, you already deal with perspective, you already deal with context, and that's something that if people are trying to make it a part of the problem domain, like your automation has to also take that into account. I really hope that LLMs can make up the difference. Like, this is where exploring foundation models, which are supposed to be this construct that summarizes all of the internet under a single tokenization scheme. Like, if you're able to extract ontology out of that, or say, well, I have these two ontologies that roughly map to these token spaces, reconcile them, those are the operations that I hope LLMs could be able to cover in a reasonable way.
Yeah, one other thing that I think LLMs, that I want to experiment with on using LLMs as it relates to ontologies and modeling and all of that, is basically like an ontology transformer that you pipe in, whatever piece of content, and it pipes out a semantic graph, RDF compliant, OWL compliant, whatever, and adding like a layer of, UX on top of that makes it really easy for the human component to be like essentially a review process of that, and also like, deleting nodes that don't make sense, or relationships that don't make sense, and adding ones that maybe we're missing, but essentially doing 90% of the work by just kind of like a content to graph transformer using, an LLM, and then the last 10% of work is just kind of like review and stuff that people like me, like I don't know, I consider myself a knowledge worker. Like, I would love to do that and kind of model out my, the content I come across into a shared graph, and kind of publish, micro books essentially out of like those things, and making all of that accessible. And so I know I'm not the only one, but most people aren't going to want to do that. So it needs to be useful to people who don't want to do it, but easy for people who want to do it, I guess.
It doesn't seem too different from search indexing in general. Like, to me, this seems similar to a search indexing strategy. So with search indexing, at least it used to be something like you just count word frequencies, get a bag of terms, and then you start like creating an index around that, like a reverse lookup table. So the semantic aspect of it, I guess the missing transform would be, okay, given a bag of terms, can we infer a related ontology, or assign things that are like assign ontology terms that are close matches to the bag of words based off of some latent dictionary and latent associations. Because now you're just trying to figure out, okay, well, if I have this content, is it compositional with other content? I'd have to think about that.
Yeah.
I want to learn more about EISPP. Where's the project at? Well, what's going on?
Where's the project at? Well, I guess that's my project, so. Let me see. So, it's a bunch of wireframes. It's also. I did a bit. Well, I guess 7 years ago, I guess almost. I did a thing where I was working with the kind of the early technology for Solid, which is a linked data platform spec, and I had a visualizer thing with D3 and Sigma, and then I had before that I had a body of research. That was like almost a dozen years ago. Called that, and that led to I guess I call ISIP the wireframes for it, and it was kind of what kind of tools, I guess, would you need to build to enable pure production. So let me see. So I mean, it's been a kind of long journey. I think for one part of ISIP I guess I worked in Vienna for a while, and there was kind of this matching of intentions and wants called the Web of Needs that I was part of for a bit. Ultimately, that didn't work out for me too well because I wasn't a good Java developer, honestly. That's why. But this is kind of this revamping where I did an IoT because ISIP is kind of this big vision. So I was looking at IoT in LoRa, and then I wanted to apply verifier credentials because I've long been in the web payments space, and then not greatly the credentials community group space, but more so starting in 2019. So I want to apply that to IoT. So I had another project called Blinky, which I was going to plug into this. Well, because ultimately with ISIP, I wanted to have like not only like a knowledge discovery space where you're discovering team members, people to work with, and kind of hopefully have it kind of be this open source kind of hardware production, and have so you form a team, you describe it as a graph, and then you compose new graphs, and you just compose part of that, and you make more products, and you keep track of it with value networks. But then you're going to have parts of it where different people are going to be making different teams, so you're going to have this like distributed production sort of thing where things are like designed globally but produced locally or something like that. And so IoT is just kind of this part where, or first I was looking at it like, well, how do you connect in with a 3D printer? So one of the things I was getting that's interesting in the decentralized space is DIDCOM, and I've been wanting to get to that. I was working with Ceramic for a little bit, developed a cryptographic signer. So before they just had Edwards curves, and so I had the P226 curves, SEC P226 curve, to that kind of to punish myself and really learn about it. And then I got into DidJot, which is using JSON web signatures, a JSON web encryption, so it's going to add to that. But I haven't gotten into DIDCOM, which supposedly as long as I think, I know Occam was doing it, but you kind of want to have a secure channel between two different entities in this kind of peer-to-peer space where you don't know that you're going over different protocols, but you don't really know your endpoints or your source, so you kind of want to have it secure amongst the whole thing. And the reason for that is you kind of have this dynamic team where things are always changing, but you want to have secure channels for that. So that's why I'm going to look into DIDCOM. So that not only helps things like I researched something called BotQ earlier. Well, Zach Hogan with MakerBot, he's like before it was open source, but he had this sort of thing where it would you click a button and it would choose from a series of printers where to print it, sort of thing. So, but like And then ISIP thing, I've also been interested in the fission community, but they have a thing called IPVM. And the thing is, so you have these. I had this idea with ISIP where you'd be clicking on things and you'd want compute jobs because originally I'm kind of an engineer. So you when you're designing like really complex projects, I had always had a vision of like not necessarily this would just be a little maker project, but really big projects like you see in the world, like how do you design a airplane or space shuttle, something really complex that has a lot of little parts, but you want to be composable together. But part of that is having access to compute. So what IPVM was is this kind of takes the IPFS Merkle tree, but then you have rather than just a CID, that's like something computable. So, that would go towards this thing where you're going through the graph and you're clicking and you're trying to, you have a project and you want to run it, and then it goes to things because ISIP was this sort of thing where you have this distributed kind of decentralized database and kind of peer-to-peer protocols organizing it all. But on top of that, you have a front end where you have like a lot of different. Not only do you have the visualization of the graph, but you have certain applications that use that to work together because it's sort of this kind of engineering collaborative space together, but like not really centralized. Like, well, Solid was not really centralized, coupled to the front end for the back end, right? But like that's kind of where it's going. Um, so that's kind of where ISIP is, and so I formed this group to kind of say, well, it still doesn't really exist, but I kind of want to figure out how to exist, and I have like all these parts in like Master 17, and then like this wireframes where everybody's like working on all these sort of things, but I want to get a really good deliverable, so that's just kind of the rush this year. Um, I don't know if that makes any sense, but kind of rambled off.
There's a lot of network related technology that you've been looking into, and it's kind of cool because it shows that the space has been here for a while and it has taken a lot of different directions. The 3D printer case is kind of interesting, like because 3D printers are supposed or were or are supposed to be a way of both getting highly decentralized production and also getting a very wide, like very high degree of flexibility in what you're building without per se being concerned with standard industrial or mechanical interfaces. So I think like that's an interesting market. It's an interesting fit. I do think that there are in the broad sense, like of pure production being made possible by these technologies, it's true. But now there has to be the next step of how does this manifest in what domain of for production, and in what way. And so this is where I think like if it's a network, like what's being transmitted on it, and because that at least would anchor these technologies into like going back to the problem of an ontology needs to have a knowledge community that can revise the vocabulary over time. Similarly, with this peer-to-peer production stuff, likely there are a lot of little niggling requirements that need to be dealt with when you're instantiating it in a particular domain. So picking the right domain at least lets one know how to move these concepts into practice. One thing that I think would be interesting would be looking at this in terms of a food community, or a community that has to deal with agricultural issues or land management issues and understanding pure production in that space. Supposedly, for instance, like there's certain initiatives which are trying to get urban food production to be more of a thing. And likewise, right now we have farmers markets. Perhaps it's possible to have urban food production markets. But since you're in an urban space, like you can make stronger guarantees of network availability, and maybe there's a way in which that kind of network routing, you can network a garden or a network of a series of urban gardens that you could state with some level of standardization, because agriculture is a pretty well understood space. Okay, well, this garden's growing these things. It has this kind of soil. You can take measurements on the soil for the soil quantity or quality. Maybe there's a way in which, this garden is growing pollinators that this garden doesn't have, so you could try to do like a transplant of that, and that could be a latent opportunity that the network can observe. It seems to me that like more interesting questions would come up around pure production if you pick a space that is starting to move into pure production from the material angle, but then doesn't have per se like a market already set up around it, for pure production to be or to become more efficient if you were to network it. Have you thought of like other domains? Because I was the only reason why this one's available to me is because my agricultural lab works in food ontologies, and I could link some papers regarding that if you want to look at how process ontologies are being formed.
Oh, okay. So you give a link.
Yeah,
Can I jump in and talk about manufacturing?
sure.
So my background is in manufacturing. I've been doing it for about 10 years now. And when I say manufacturing, it's I'm working at a small company that does like embedded engineering, PCB design, engineering services, and things like that. I've also worked on several open source hardware projects. And so I think where my interests intersect in all this is how to basically turn open hardware into a marketable good. Because there's the fundamental problem of like so in open source software there's a fundamental like infinite resource where if you want to copy a project you just fork it and there's no cost, and what the cost for forking it is minimal, and the implementation costs are basically knowledge costs and knowledge worker hours of somebody having to maintain a knowledge understanding of how the system works and how to implement it. And for hardware, though, there's an added cost in not only having to have somebody maintain and run the system and like implement the application, there's also a physical goods and service issue. And that one, there's a existing economy around that, but there's not really a series of methodologies to share and capture the value in a way that is low friction. So that's one of the main things I'm most interested in right now is how to basically like make that type of both for myself and other people and for projects I'm working on scale at a layer so that it can be things can scale linearly without having to have like every fifth person I deal with has to have their own separate contract, having to have like corporate entities that basically manage things, having to have like layers of managerial teams that manage just the taxes and the infrastructural burden of managing like projects and things like that. Like all these tools basically make the process of doing fundamental work more difficult because it requires people to basically do the hand shuffling of information back and forth. So that's my primary interest in most of this. In use cases that I have available that need a service like this, I've got a print business, I've got a embedded engineering business, I've got a software development business, I've got a basically just 3D printing, as well as just some manufacturing in general, engineering services. And the other flip side of this coin is the community aspect of it. So I also run like the open source hardware group in Oklahoma City. And so I've been looking for is basically like how to basically like both like incentivize people to get into design and engineering, and do it in a way that allows for like a free flow of information without basically like creating a I think you call it like the rug pull problem or the misappropriation of the commons problem or the I guess privatization of the commons problem. But basically, like when you take something that has value and then you don't participate in the value proposition of supporting the things that created the value in the first place. Um, and that's a general problem. I think that's a universal problem with open hardware, but that's also something I'm quite interested in. So at the very least, what I have is like I got a bunch of use cases that I think would be useful for discussion, as well as a couple of possible real world applications that go into this. And on the food topic, I've got a bunch of interests, and one of the companies was an IoT company that built open hardware sensors for ag and indoor grow operations. And so there's a lot of overlap in that industry and how to basically build like low friction tooling that's open source, but still find revenue generators inside of that for continued development. So.
So, with the hardware production, what kind of hardware are you talking about? Like mainly electronic boards or what?
Electronics, robotics. So primarily, my background is in embedded and electrical engineering. So mine mainly PCBs. But I've also done work with like designing a open source free, like open source plasma cutter, open source like plastic shredder, open source. I made a zip tie once, and somebody actually downloaded it. Um, and just random stuff like that. But I also have interest in doing robotics, print and 3D printing. So the print company does like mostly print media. So like and that's tied to like UV printing. So that's like direct to object printing, and direct to garment and like and other things like that. So and the problem right now is that the value proposition for a lot of these projects are based on finding somebody with a need and then making sure it's financially viable to pursue a project around. So the need discovery and the value proposition discovery are major time sinks in this venture in these ventures right now. Um, and that I think that's a problem fit problem that I think is very apt for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think so.
No,
Go ahead.
I had long think that if you can model things correctly and have the graph and things kind of come together by sigmergic collaboration, like ants leaving pheromone. Well, we had a thing called swarm Linda earlier, so things kind of want to self aggregate and find each other, but you have to describe them in such a way that you know the kind of same thing. It's like searching through like all the open source stuff on GitHub. Eventually, you'll find something. Oh, that's useful to me, but you could accelerate that if you could describe it in such a way with the metadata. But then the problem is, how do you get the metadata there? But if once you have the metadata there and how things link together, then you can then in addition, which is also kind of a hard problem, you can use things like value flows and NRP logging to keep track of like how people are contribute. So then you could have all these graphs composing together, and you could be sharing value. And then like the problem of like who is this useful for? Well, the network could help you find who's it useful for, because the idea is you're trying to me you're trying to put enough structure in your software system. Well, and so you can have like a lot of chaos in the real world because you want to favor creativity, um, sort of thing. So you kind of want to enable people to do most things that they kind of want and what they think about, and like rather than just be constrained by oh the same old thing and the same old kind of business model, the same old jobs, the same etc. Because like creativity is kind of endless. So it was this is kind of this economic, well, why I call it also the matchmaking wayfarer. You're trying to hook people up to do opportunities, but once people are hooked up voluntarily and creating value, then that value is shared in proportion to like what people have contributed. I mean, sometimes that's kind of hard retroactively, I guess, but this is kind of the general idea. So rather than like you form these big companies with these patents and everything gets uh, congregated in there, and you have a hierarchical method, and everybody's like working with all these roles, and that's how kind of, and then the roles are interoperable. But how can you get like all the projects and the individuals be interoperable so you can have more expressivity, and then you could um, just like well, there's not enough majors really, and there's not enough like different types of companies. So how do you enhance that? So that was kind of probably maybe how I give Loki a little bit, but I know Ken, you had something to say too, but
I'm really interested by the vidcom you mentioned earlier. I hadn't heard of that before, and looked up, and it essentially looks like a like successor to like SMTP, but a decentralized style and encryption like baked in from the beginning. I'm still trying to figure out most of what value flows is entirely, but it's starting to click more, so might be able to contribute more and more over time.
yeah, sure. And also, I kind of liked your voluntary cooperation because that's the kind of idea like like in the makerspace and the hackerspace, people are going to be interested in projects, but then like they're going to develop the product, but they're not going to like have a The idea is like not to have a company just for or an organization of people just to like exist, you know, and it becomes self-regulating because the really creative people are going to want to do some other things, but they're also going to want to um, take some of that knowledge and repurpose it in other ways. Um, so like voluntary is like, well, I don't know if it was Albert Reingold or whoever, but you kind of have these flash mobs where people kind of come together and do something. Well, take that over in engineering, people come together and do something, and then they disband, and then they do something else, you know, sort of thing. But there's kind of hopefully like it's the answer to our intelligence. There's the must smell signaling that people realize that there's something going on and it relates to what they're doing, and then you do it.
There seems to be a latent. Go ahead.
I've already got plans to like convert my work's like main site to have more either microdata or RDFA stuff involved in it, and find some way to like loop in IPNS and IPFS stuff with that, just for funsies.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff is also like happening already in an ad hoc way. I think part of what I think would be useful is just creating a way of monitoring and verifying success of certain methodologies, and then doing like a retrospective of like this worked really well, and maybe this would be like where a LLM would work really well. It's like you just input the tasks that you did, the efforts that you went through, the conversations that you had on the task as a fly on the wall like recording of just meetings and and events, and then an output of the results, and then use that to kind of like churn through project after project after project to create like maybe design paradigms for abstract project coalition. Because like for example, like I worked on a project that I worked on it like over the summer during COVID, I worked at Spec, which is like an open hardware, open software, like community space. And through that, I basically worked on a couple of open hardware projects, and then I got linked into a like public invention, which does mostly invention and science and discovery for the public good. And through that, I did a contribution for an open hardware project that built a display for a ventilator. And through that, I got invited to work on a NASA project, which was a high value, high visibility um, project that involved building control systems for like an oxygen concentrator. And that was, but like the steps that went through, none of that was like prescribed. It was all like ad hoc. And I don't think I could tell you how to replicate that. Because it was just like hearsay, network locations, chance, and like a confluence of availability options that allowed it to all happen. But like reproducing that is almost impossible. But I feel like that like capturing the structure of that could maybe minimize the risks required to reproduce something like that, and maybe make it into like a something that you can basically like ad hoc pull from somebody who's got the same qualifications and classifications, and then rebuild a team like that without having to go through all the steps necessary to verify, vet, and through normal social processes, talent and skill sets.
I can speak to the first part of what you were saying. I too would kind of believe that we need to define the layers of discoverability in terms of an ecosystem of agents. Like it becomes more clear to me when we're having discussions that there have to be these latent transactions for information processing happening on some layer where the opportunities for routing are produced and the opportunities to fill in gaps in description are identified, including, so for instance, if we're doing this issue of nano publication, there's the actual unstructured content of a publication. There's the metadata that the author assigns to the content. of what they believe is inside the content. And there's the degree to which that metadata could reflect the total possible set of descriptions that can be assigned to the content itself. So the author, in other words, is not fully trusted because the author is only taking their perspective of what's inside of the content, but there could be other perspectives that can be read from the content, so the metadata could expand. And then from there, you have this other further network of things that are related to, okay, given that we know this metadata of the content, given that I can do this kind of associative reading on the content, how does other content weave into it? How do I co-index that content with other content? And so that can be done with an agent that would be similar to a web crawler, I suppose, except that web crawler is being operated on this distributed network of information. Maybe the web transactions themselves are distributed. And then there's the final thing, which is sort of untapped, which is the market, almost like a market maker, really, where the opportunities for serendipity that could occur between actors that are generating content for further collaboration. That's a problem that I've been thinking about for a bit now, just because I wanted to. Because when it comes to recommendation engines, sometimes recommendations are not that great because they're merely repetitions of your previous behavior, and they're not inferences on how you could behave, what you could buy, that you could use, who you could meet. That's only slightly outside of your Overton window, as it were, so that if you interact with them, then somehow both your perspectives would expand. Those seem to be problems which haven't been tapped fully, I guess, except maybe with professional settings like LinkedIn and Facebook. They're probably doing this kind of person-to-person routing, but in the sense of production, it's not being done as well. And so with patents, with technology, I think that's interesting because with a patent, you're coming up with something new, but the expertise you're relying on is often old. And so there's actually a differential that you have to declare with a patent of what's new and what's not. So there's still an opportunity to get people with certain expertise that maps on to your problem, even though that the actual contribution might not be fully modeled in the vocabulary yet.
Yeah, just to capture that one idea, so one of the things that the value flow needed to be able to capture the information about the serendipitous aspects of I guess it'd be value fit or or recommendations. Part of that is that you have to be able to internally model the state space change of the agent as they progress. And so there's two different ways of thinking about it. One is that there's a time domain for all these interactions where the development has to happen in a stepwise process. And the other one is that you need to have you need to do like a future prediction on top of on the state space change. So, and sometimes to do that that evaluation, you have to be able to capture the results of the state space change. So, like for example, the best way one of the ways to think about it is that if you think about how you learned to read a research paper or how you learned to appreciate music or literature, you don't normally start with the most complex esoteric piece in the information space. You don't start listening to Bach first. You start listening to things that have that resonate with you, and that you can then maybe the recommendations get more and more esoteric or more specialized as you learn what you like, and then but usually that what you learn is what you like is determined based on the previous interactions or the previous things you listened to. So and part of it's just creating a vocabulary for and a internal modeling of what's possible. And so so what you're discovering is not just the existing level at which a person or a agent is currently at, but it's also mapping onto the possible results of either stretching them and seeing how far they're willing to stretch, and then doing so basically a test case scenario, given a small task, what would be the results? What's the results on your completion of that task? And that can be used to help inform the agent's ability to take on other tasks, learn new things, or develop in different directions. Usually the easy case is when you ask for a book recommendation, they give you three options, and those three options, based on what you read and what you actually resonate with you, would then turn into new recommendations based on those results. And that would be like a stepwise small action that can help direct the future projection of the state of the agent's state space. Um, and I think that being turned into like a recommendation model or a model of like of project interaction, I see that possibly being captured inside of an LLM. And I think that could be, I'd be very interested in to figure out how to do that and how to represent that.
I like that a lot. Actually, it makes a lot of sense because at least in the notion of, well, first of all, the first thing you said about, oh yeah, we need to capture the idea of serendipity via the representation of the diversifying of the internal state of the agent and the differentiating of the internal state of the agent. I agree with that entirely. I can't say why, but it makes intuitive sense. The next thing is that yeah, for the most part, when I was thinking about learning and modeling learning as and learning, and so for instance, if we have it's interesting you mentioned music because when I was first thinking about this problem with someone else, they thought of it in terms of if I had a music genre that I was listening to, and then I wanted someone to listen to and make sense of an entirely different music genre, could we differentiate between these two genres and come up with a series of points in between that reflect different songs that could transition you from one genre to another genre in a way that makes sense? So how do you get someone from blues to hip hop, which shouldn't be too much of a difference? Then how do you get someone from hip hop to, I don't know, something really esoteric or something really different? Would be a good one. Maybe like Indian classical, right? And so suddenly, like that, you have to lose so much structure to get from one to the other. But you can probably have ways of listening to songs in between so that it doesn't seem as jarring to move from one to the other. I'm reminded of this, but what you mentioned about the smaller tasks imposing into the larger tasks, that ends up being like an entirely different vector. But I think it also reflects more seriously what you'd want for someone to have more growth, somehow like a more nuanced understanding of themselves or a situation, and that I think would be reflected in some kind of increase in semantic diversity. So yeah, like I can see an LLM being quite useful here if we're able to, with like very easily track, I don't know, the latent activation spaces that a particular concept has on the interior of an LLM. Like it's something that I think it definitely seems possible, but I haven't looked into it enough depth to know how to do that explicitly. Because you're not really using an LLM as a black box anymore. You're now introspecting on the contents and weights of the LLM to do your modeling with, and I'm not aware of any project that's gone into that yet. Maybe one like Mistral or Mixtral, which I forget which one, where they edit like single weights. That probably implies that you have to be able to observe single weights. I'd be looking into something like that.
Yeah, I could see that. Like, I think that the main takeaway though is I think that like the LLM or the neural network style weight distribution, I think is a really powerful way of creating a meta database or unstructured database of information that doesn't necessarily like have predefined labelings. And some of the work being done in creating like quantized or like 1 bit networks, I think is really interesting because basically what it does is it takes the entire network and it takes it down to the bare bones like Bayesian level like gargantuan decision tree layer. And I think that like I think what we're slowly coming towards that like Bayesian and Markovian style like chains and decision processes have are extremely expressive in a way that I don't think that we quite appreciate the diversity of tasks that can be applied to it. Um, and then I think that there's other things on top of that, like creating relational databases that are more human readable or more mechanical, and then creating maybe data duplication in a way that in kind of the same way that like in the human psyche we have like a long-term, short-term storage for memories and information, and we use them differently for different tasks. And in the same way, I think there's a lot of benefit. And this is almost like cutting edge stuff, but like we're slowly going to the point where we'll have like a diversity of databases that both are and the diversity of experts that are both like task oriented and then like data type oriented, based on what type of data is being ingested and how it's being used, and how to basically decrease the computational or how to increase the computational efficiency of these actions. Because the computational efficiency is also a major issue that's not really talked about in the semantic space, but is hugely topical when you start thinking about like this has to be able to run on a machine, and then as their state space gets gargantuan, it requires more and more compute power to really actually make use of it. And then the more it gets useful, the more you want to run it, the more you want to run it, the more compute you use, and then you need to start thinking about how do you optimize your semantic space so that it can be used in a way that is, I guess, energy efficient, in this terms where everything has to be like at the bigger level. There's physical reality that all these processes are running on, and those introduce limited resource constraints.
I'm looking into so there's an interesting case with autoencoders, at least some of the original, still not some of the original ones. Like when people were using DALI, they noticed a creation of like textual tags that were that are appearing in the images. So, for instance, if you were if you had if you prompted DALI for an image, oh, make me an image of two whales talking about their food. There were, of course, like it comes up with two whales, and there's a speech bubble. Inside the speech bubble, there's some nonsense text. Interestingly enough, if you copy that nonsense text and you put it into DALI, it gives you a collection of images of shrimp. And so that was interesting to me because it does show like a level of concept learning where the tag itself was not a human readable tag, but the tag still reflected the latent semantics of whales, of what whales eat. But it I haven't. I'm a little bit perplexed, if only because there's only a limited number of parameters that you can exploit from a neural network, and if you're training it on tokens that are coming strictly from your corpus rather than learning or creating new tokens, that seems like you would eventually run into bottlenecks where you'd have to retrain the model if you're extending the semantic domain somehow, every particular time. Which to me seems like it would restrict the LLMs into simply being retrieval, until you're hitting some limit of the domain where you add new tokens and you'll have to train it again. There seems to be, I'm not sure if it's a limiting factor in practice. I just wondering if that will end up becoming something that will be an issue when you're having an economy that's expanding with new capabilities.
I mean, it's already kind of an issue. If you think about, if you take a human model of it, if you think about like I do this a lot because I do a lot of context switching. Like I'll switch from doing like embedded C programming to doing PCB design, to doing business management, to doing taxes, to doing basically a lot of tasks that require a large mental load, and a large skill switch. It takes usually somewhere between 1 to 3 months to become an expert or regain the expertise needed to do any of those particular tasks well. But I have a core of understanding that allows me to quickly pick up those tasks again. I see what's going to end up happening is that we'll end up probably having like a mixture of experts, where you'll have a general purpose cross-trained model that then creates the instruction set that then gets passed along to the mixture of experts that then are domain specific on particular tasks, and you'll end up having like particular domain experts that are semi-frozen in time and specifically tagged to certain tasks. That way you get the benefit of having a optimized, let's say a code generator for like C, C++, Python, Java, JavaScript, and all that. But when you want to go write a novel, you don't. Your 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 English novel doesn't get spattered with C, C++ syntax, because that's what the LLM is trained up on. And so I think that's, and I think that what we're slowly doing, and what I love about LLMs and AI is that it's for the first time we have an empirical um, whiteboard to test ideas and concepts from almost 10,000 years of like natural philosophy, or natural physics, that allows us to actually take a objective look at some of these ideas that we've had about how the mind works, how conceptualization works, and then actually get like, oh, we tried this thing, this is what we got, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. I don't know why this worked, but it really fits well with this theory, but the other theory doesn't make any sense when you apply it. So I see a lot of like out of this coming an emergence of like a unified theory of philosophy, which I think will be very useful in the next 100 years.
Actually, you mentioned a great point, which is that yeah, mixture of experts models, they give you a linear scaling factor when it comes to new domains. And I guess if you're just creating, well, I guess the first layer of a mixture of experts models and the weight for distributing across experts, you have to increase that to a certain level of dimensionality before you can add too many experts on top of this. But that's actually an interesting point. Maybe there's a way that you can differentiate, and over time you have maybe old experts and new experts, or experts across these different domains that could come together, and then maybe that ends up being how the aggregate community goes. If you were to somehow have, I guess for Lavender, the one had their own local model, which would be Lavender's theory of mind, as it were, for an individual. And then the communication would occur between, like, laterally for the public model, for finding people. Like the local models would slowly train the public model that everyone has access to for training purposes, but it can only use as a black box for getting recommendations out of. Yeah, like it's interesting. Okay, well, how if you're adding more people to the network, how does that create an issue with that recommendation aspect if that network has to be constantly retrained? But yeah, mixture of experts, they can give you a linear factor, which could allow maybe new ontology domains or new versions of ontologies to be added onto, and that could help.
Um, the only other thing I did during this week that is kind of related to our space is I uh, got a kit put together for IPNS based DIDs and kind of got the resolver for them updated and more modern. So it's all beta still, but I think I've got it all wired up now for you to use it the same way you would DID web.
IPNS is an interplanetary name system, or
Yeah, and you can use that with a DNS link, and that's where you just put a text record uh, in your DNS records with the IPFS URL, and then the gateways resolve it through DNS resolution.
I would be very curious to know more, but I think that can I use this to like set up a local IPNS system? I feel like there's like a lot of technology leap that I'm not really able to like fully appreciate. But my end goal,
Um, this is all the scaffolding to create the document. So it's just like the JSON LD for the DID document that comes out of this, and then like you could use like I work at Firebase, so we've got one. You could use the IPNS name API, or you could use W3 names API as well. Those are the only two I know of.
okay. But I mean,
You can use Kubo as well locally, but those are the two cloud ones.
I think I'd like to. I think I'd like maybe present on that sometime. So I'd be interested to see in either in this space or another space. But I'd be interested to see how that would interplay with some of the other like. So one of the other side gigs I'm working on right now is building up a micro data center and figuring out if it's cost effective. Um, and for self-hosting of servers and using like existing IP infrastructure. So for example, I mean, it sounds dumb, but like called AT&T, got a quote for like what a fiber install for like a 5 gigabit symmetric up down would look like, and then figure out the power usage for like a 42U rack, and then figure out whether or not it's cost effective to rent rack space for applications, or find an application to shove in the rack to make it cost effective to pay for power, data, and heating and cooling. So I'm trying to work out numbers for what that would look like, but application for using that is still kind of an open question.
If anybody has access to surplus equipment to make it economical, it's probably you.
This is the pile of free servers I have is kind of mind blowing right now. If you want to have one, they're going cheap.
I might message you, see if you've got anything low powered for Linux. I don't really run much higher power stuff, so I kind of like the older, junkier boxes.
Yeah, I've been really happy with the ones I've got. They're like sub 200 watts, and they're basically basically 8 gigabyte. Anyways, 8 gigabits, 4 cores, older gen, but sub 200 watts, and fairly quiet for a server.
Yeah, I don't like lots of heat and lots of that for like the things I run near my home.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah. Should I keep people on the call, or is there anything else to kind of talk about this week, or should we wrap it up and meet next week, or what's the kind of the plan?
I think we're good. Got everything out of our system.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier, I think there was somebody in the Summer Protocols who was doing LLM and building like graph agents that looked interesting. I put a link in the links, I think, but maybe I was gonna reach out to him, but I didn't quite know what to write. But maybe I'll just kind of ping him somehow and see if they want to talk to people here, or if that would be useful. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
all right, catch
I'm
you
gonna
later.
jump off. You all have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Great meeting you all. Bye.
Yep, thank you.
Good
Bye.
meeting you, Ken.
I think it went well.
That's good.
That's-
Yeah, thanks for showing up.
Yeah, anything you want to ask before I head out?
No. I don't know. Let me end the recording, but let's see.